The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between two bright stars. It was bigger than Earth's moon and made of crystal that sparkled like diamonds. Inside its enormous halls, creatures from across the galaxy gathered for the most important meeting in known space. Captain Jake Morrison pressed his face against the thick glass window of the human section. He had never seen anything like this before. Floating jellyfish-like beings drifted through the air, their bodies glowing with different colors as they talked to each other. Giant bug creatures with shiny shells walked on 6 legs, their voices clicking and buzzing. Snake-like aliens slithered across the floor, leaving trails of strange-smelling liquid behind them. "Hard to believe we're really here," said Ambassador Lisa Carter as she joined Jake at the window. She was a small woman with gray hair, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. In her hands, she held a thick folder full of papers about Earth and humanity. 3 years ago, nobody in this place even knew we existed, Jake replied. Now look at us. 12 humans in a room with thousands of aliens. Lisa nodded and looked down at her notes. Earth had only joined the Galactic Council 3 years before. Most of the alien species had been members for hundreds or even thousands of years. The humans were like new kids at a very old school, and nobody really cared what they had to say. The meeting hall was so big that Jake could barely see the other side. Thousands of different creatures sat in sections based on their species. The most powerful ones sat near the front, in comfortable seats with the best view. The Altarian Federation had a whole section to themselves, with floating platforms and glowing screens. The Centauri Collective brought over 200 representatives, all wearing matching silver uniforms. The human section was way in the back, squeezed between 2 other small groups. They had 12 simple chairs and 1 small table. Jake counted the other species around them. There was a group of plant-like beings who communicated by changing the color of their leaves. Next to them sat some creatures that looked like walking rocks, speaking to each other in deep, rumbling voices. "Ladies and gentlemen, beings of all forms," announced a loud voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The 747th Grand Assembly of the Galactic Council will now begin." The noise in the hall slowly died down as everyone turned to look at the center stage. A huge creature slithered up to the speaking platform. It was at least 30 feet long, with scales that changed color from green to blue to purple. This was Counselor Vexitar of the Hegemony, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "We gather today to discuss matters of great importance," Vexitar said, his voice hissing through speakers around the hall. "The outer territories require new mining operations. Several disputes must be settled. Resources must be divided fairly among the worthy species." Jake noticed how Vexitar said, "worthy species," and wondered if humans counted as worthy in his mind. Dr. Alan Rodriguez, Earth's science advisor, was sitting next to Lisa with his own pile of papers. He was a thin man with thick glasses who rarely spoke unless he had something very important to say. Now he was frowning as he read through data on his tablet. "The first matter concerns the mining rights in the Kepler system," Vexitar continued. "Rich deposits of quantum crystals have been discovered on 3 planets. The hegemony proposes that we divide these rights among the established powers." A holographic display appeared above the speaking platform, showing star maps and mining data. Jake could see that the Kepler system had several planets, and at least 3 of them had intelligent life. The creatures living there were still using primitive technology, but they were clearly smart enough to build cities and art. "Excuse me," Lisa said, standing up in the human section. Her voice was small compared to the huge hall, but the speaking system picked it up and made it louder. "I would like to address the assembly about this proposal." A wave of clicking, buzzing, and hissing sounds swept through the hall. Some creatures turned to look at the human section with what might have been amusement. Others simply ignored Lisa completely. Vexitar's large head turned toward the human section. His eyes were like black glass, cold and uninterested. "The human representative wishes to speak." "Very well. The Council recognizes Ambassador Carter of the Terran Federation." Lisa walked down to a smaller speaking platform near the center of the hall. She looked tiny, surrounded by all the massive alien beings, but she held her head high and spoke clearly. "Thank you, Counselor. I have reviewed the data about the Kepler system, and I must point out that 3 of the planets contain intelligent civilizations. These beings have rights that should be respected. Any mining operations would destroy their homes and possibly wipe out entire cultures." The hall erupted in noise. Some creatures made sounds that might have been laughter. Others buzzed and clicked, in what sounded like conversations. Jake could see several of the more powerful delegations shaking their heads or making dismissive gestures. A creature that looked like a walking tree with glowing fruit spoke up from the Centauri section. "The human representative lacks understanding of galactic economics. These primitive civilizations contribute nothing to galactic society. The resources could benefit billions of advanced beings. But they're still alive, still intelligent," Lisa insisted. "They have art, music, families. They deserve the chance to develop on their own." Vextar raised one of his clawed hands for silence. "The human concern has been noted and will be included in the official record. However, species with limited galactic experience may not fully understand the complexities of such decisions. The Council will proceed with the original proposal." Jake felt his face getting hot with anger, but he kept his mouth shut. Around him, the other humans looked just as frustrated. Dr. Rodriguez was making notes on his tablet, his pen moving fast across the screen. The voting began, and Jake watched as species after species approved the mining rights. The hegemony would get the largest share, followed by the Altarian Federation and the Centauri Collective. A few smaller species would get tiny portions. The primitive civilizations in the Kepler system were never mentioned again. "Any final comments before we move to the next matter?" Vextar asked. Lisa tried to speak again, but Vextar had already moved on to discussing trade routes through the Vega system. Once again, the most powerful species divided up the best opportunities among themselves. When Lisa requested time to suggest alternative routes that might be safer for smaller ships, she was told that the schedule was too tight for minor concerns. The meeting continued for hours. Every major decision was made by the same group of powerful species. They divided up mining rights, trade routes, and even research opportunities as if they owned the entire galaxy. Smaller species were allowed to speak, but their suggestions were politely ignored or dismissed as unrealistic. As the day wore on, Jake began to understand how the galactic government really worked. It wasn't about fairness or justice. It was about power, and humans had very little of it. The other species saw Earth as a backward planet full of primitive creatures who had barely learned to travel between stars. When the session finally ended, Jake watched as the various delegations filed out of the hall. The powerful species were surrounded by advisors and assistants, already making plans for their new territories and resources. The smaller groups, including the humans, gathered their papers and left quietly. "Well, that was educational," Dr. Rodriguez said, as they walked back to their quarters. "Educational and frustrating," Lisa replied. "They treat us like children who don't understand how the real world works." Jake looked back at the empty meeting hall. Maybe it's time they learned something about humans they don't expect. None of them knew it yet, but that learning process was about to begin in ways the Galactic Council could never imagine. The species they had dismissed as insignificant was about to show them what real power looked like. 3 months had passed since the disappointing council meeting, but things in human space were far from quiet. Trade ships traveling through the outer colonies began reporting strange sightings. Vessels that didn't match any known human designs were spotted near mining stations and research outposts. When questioned, human officials simply said they were conducting routine operations. Commander Rick Hayes stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the stars through the main view screen. His ship was one of Earth's newer exploration vessels, though it looked ordinary enough from the outside. Gray metal hull, standard weapon ports, and the usual communication arrays. Nothing that would make other species take a second look. "Commander, we're picking up multiple contacts ahead," reported Lieutenant Amy Foster from the tactical station. She was young but sharp, with quick reflexes and an even quicker mind. 5 ships, hegemony design, They're in formation around the New Brisbane colony. Rick frowned. New Brisbane was a human farming colony, established just 2 years ago on a pleasant world with good soil and clean water. It was well inside human territory, nowhere near any disputed boundaries. What are they doing here? He wondered aloud. Chief Engineer Pete Collins looked up from his console near the back of the bridge. Pete was an older man with graying hair and hands that were always stained with engine grease. "Maybe they're lost," he said with a grin that showed he didn't believe it for a second. "Open a channel," Rick ordered. The view screen flickered and showed the bridge of a hegemony warship. The captain was a typical member of his species, with scales that shifted from blue to green and cold black eyes. Behind him, Rick could see other snake-like creatures working at various stations. "I am Commander Sectar of the Hegemony Patrol Vessel Vengeance," the alien said. His voice had the same hissing quality as Counselor Vextar. "You will withdraw from this system immediately." Rick kept his expression calm, even though he felt anger building in his chest. "Commander, this is human space. You're the ones who need to withdraw." Sectar's scales darkened to a deep purple, which Rick knew was a sign of anger in hegemony species. "Primitive humans do not dictate terms to the hegemony. We are conducting a resource survey of this system. Your presence interferes with our operations." "A resource survey," Rick repeated slowly. "In our space. Without permission. The hegemony requires no permission from lesser species," Sectar replied. "Withdraw, or we will force you to withdraw." Rick looked around his bridge. Amy had her hand hovering over the weapons controls. Pete was watching him carefully, waiting for orders. The rest of the crew sat at their stations, tense but ready. "Pete, are we ready for a field test?" Rick asked quietly. Pete's grin got wider. "All systems are green, Commander. The new modifications are working perfectly." Rick turned back to the view screen. "Commander Sectar, I'm afraid I can't do that. This is human territory and you're not welcome here." Sectar's scales turned almost black with rage. "Then you will learn why the hegemony rules this galaxy." He cut the communication channel. 5 ships moving to attack formation, Amy reported. "They're charging weapons." "Amy, take us to Condition Red. Pete, activate the new systems." "With pleasure," Pete said, his fingers dancing over his controls. The Defiance began to change, not in any way that could be seen from outside, but every sensor on the ship registered the shift. The hull started vibrating at a frequency that made it partially exist in normal space, and partially exist somewhere else entirely. "Phase drive active," Pete announced. "We're now operating in quantum superposition." The hegemony ships opened fire, sending bright beams of energy toward the Defiance. The beams passed right through the human ship as if it wasn't there. On their screens, the hegemony crews saw their target flicker like a ghost. "Now let's show them something they've never seen before," Rick said. "Amy, take us through their formation." The Defiance moved forward, passing through the solid hulls of the hegemony ships like they were made of air. Rick watched as his ship emerged behind the enemy formation, completely untouched by their weapons. "Impossible," came Sectar's voice over the communication channel. "No species has technology like this." "You're right," Rick replied. "No other species does. But then again, you never bothered to learn what humans are capable of." Back on Earth, in a hidden facility deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Dr. Rachel Kim was working on problems that had puzzled the galaxy for centuries. Her laboratory was filled with computers, holographic displays, and strange devices that hummed with barely contained energy. Rachel was a small woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see patterns where others saw only chaos. She had spent years studying how the human brain worked differently from alien minds. While other species had evolved specialized intelligence for specific environments, humans had developed something unique. They could adapt to almost any situation and see connections that escaped more focused minds. "Computer, show me the galactic energy distribution problem again," she said. A 3-dimensional map appeared in the air above her desk. It showed how energy moved through the galaxy, from massive power stations to billions of worlds. The system was incredibly inefficient, with huge amounts of power lost during transmission. The Galactic Council had been working on this problem for over 1,000 years without finding a good solution. Rachel stared at the map for a long time, letting her mind wander. She thought about how water flowed down a mountain, finding the easiest path. She thought about how birds flew in formation to save energy. She thought about how human cities grew organically, creating efficient networks without central planning. Suddenly, she saw it, the pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. Computer model a distributed network system. Instead of sending power from central stations, what if every world generated and shared energy locally? The computer processed her request and displayed the results. Energy loss dropped by 80%. Distribution became more reliable. The entire galactic power grid could be revolutionized using principles that seemed obvious once you saw them. Why didn't anyone think of this before? She wondered aloud. The answer came to her immediately. Other species thought in straight lines, in hierarchies and rigid systems. They saw problems as things to be solved by applying more force or building bigger machines. Humans saw problems as puzzles that might have unexpected solutions. Rachel began working on other galactic challenges. Communication delays across vast distances, resource allocation conflicts, even the traffic control problems that plagued busy star systems. One by one, human intuition found answers that had escaped alien logic for centuries. Meanwhile, back in space, Commander Hayes received new orders that surprised him. Instead of the usual patrol missions and diplomatic escorts, Earth's military was taking a more active role in protecting human interests. "We're not backing down anymore," Amy observed as she read through the new mission briefings. "About time," Pete said from his workstation. "I'm tired of being treated like we don't belong here." Rick nodded as he studied their next assignment. A convoy of human trade ships was being harassed by pirates in the Tau Ceti system. Local authorities claimed they were too busy to help, but Rick suspected they just didn't care about human problems. "Set course for Tau Ceti," he ordered. "Let's go show some pirates what happens when they mess with the wrong species." The Defiance jumped to hyperspace, but it wasn't traveling alone. Similar ships were launching from human bases throughout the galaxy. Earth's government had made a decision that would change everything. They were done being ignored, done being dismissed, and done accepting that humans didn't matter in galactic affairs. The overlooked colonies had been busy during those 3 months since the council meeting. While the galaxy's attention was focused elsewhere, human engineers had been developing new technologies. Human scientists had been solving old problems. Human strategists had been preparing for the day when Earth would no longer be content to sit in the back of the meeting hall. As Rick watched the stars stream past his view screen, he knew that day was coming soon. The galaxy had dismissed humanity as primitive and weak. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The species they had overlooked was about to show them what human ingenuity could accomplish when it was finally given the chance to shine. And once that demonstration began, the balance of power in the galaxy would never be the same again. The crisis began when massive Cromax battle stations appeared at the most important hyperspace routes in the galaxy. These floating fortresses were the size of small moons, covered in weapon systems and protected by energy shields that could stop anything the galaxy had ever built. General Zekoth, the Cromax military leader, made his demands simple and clear. All species will pay the new transit fees, or they will not travel through our controlled space, his announcement declared across all galactic communication networks. The time has come for lesser civilizations to understand their proper place. Cromax Empire had always been one of the most aggressive species in the galaxy. They looked like giant crabs, with thick armor plating and claws that could crush steel. Their ships were built like moving fortresses, designed to overwhelm enemies through sheer firepower and heavy armor. Within days, trade between star systems ground to a halt. Merchant vessels sat at spaceports, unable to reach their destinations. Food shipments couldn't get through to colonies that depended on them. Medical supplies were trapped in warehouses while people died waiting for treatment. The Galactic Council called an emergency session, but General Zekoth's representative made the Cromax position perfectly clear. Species that cannot defend their interests do not deserve to prosper. The strong rule and the weak serve. This is the natural order. Ambassador Lisa Carter stood to address the assembly once again. The Cromax blockade violates every treaty and agreement that holds our civilization together. This cannot be allowed to continue. The response from the established powers was disappointing but not surprising. The hegemony suggested negotiating new trade agreements that would give the Cromax what they wanted. The Altarian Federation proposed forming a committee to study the situation. The Centauri Collective recommended patience while diplomatic solutions were explored. In other words, Lisa said to Jake Morrison as they left the session, nobody wants to fight the Cromax, so they're willing to let them win. Jake nodded grimly. Good thing we're not nobody. 3 days later, Admiral Kate Sullivan received orders. That made her smile for the first time in months. Earth's government had authorized her to break the blockade by any means necessary. Her fleet consisted of 30 ships, all of them built with the new technologies that human engineers had been developing in secret. The galactic media covered the approaching confrontation with barely concealed amusement. Reporters from dozens of species sent live broadcasts as the tiny human fleet approached the massive Cromax battle station, guarding the Vega system hyperspace junction. This appears to be a demonstration of human stubbornness rather than strategic thinking, commented one Altarian news anchor. 30 small ships against over 200 Cromax vessels seems more like suicide than warfare. General Zekath himself came aboard his flagship to watch the battle. The massive Cromax commander was 12 feet tall and covered in armor that had been decorated with trophies from previous victories. His claws clicked against his command chair as he watched the human ships approach. These primitives dare to challenge the might of the Cromax Empire, he rumbled to his officers. We will crush them quickly and display their wreckage as a warning to other species. Admiral Sullivan stood on the bridge of her flagship, the UES Horizon. She was a tall woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. Around her, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, preparing for what most of the galaxy expected to be a very short fight. Admiral, all ships report ready, announced Lieutenant Commander Tony Walsh from the tactical station. Tony was young but brilliant, with a mind that could see patterns in chaos and find order in confusion. Very well, Kate said calmly. Begin Phase 1. The human ship suddenly changed course, spreading out in what looked like a random pattern. To alien observers, it appeared that the humans had lost formation and were scattering in panic. The Cromax weapons systems locked onto the nearest targets, confident that this would be over quickly. Then something happened that nobody in the galaxy had ever seen before. The human ships began flickering in and out of normal space. One moment they were there, solid and real. The next moment they were ghostly images that weapons fire passed right through. But unlike the simple phase drive that Commander Hayes had used against the Hegemony Patrol, these ships were doing something far more complex. What are they doing? General Zekath demanded as his weapons missed target after target. His science officer, a smaller Cromax with faster reflexes, studied the sensor readings with growing confusion. Sir, they appear to be existing in multiple dimensional states, simultaneously. Our targeting systems cannot lock onto them properly. The human ships weren't just phasing out of normal space. They were using quantum mechanics to exist in several places at once, making it impossible for conventional weapons to hit them. But that was only the beginning. Dr. Rachel Kim's research had revealed something important about Cromax psychology. Like many predator species, they had instinctive fear responses that could be triggered by specific patterns of light and sound. The human ships began broadcasting carefully designed signals that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the primitive parts of Cromax brains. On the Cromax command ship, General Zekath suddenly felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a juvenile. Fear, not rational concern about battle tactics, but deep, animal terror that made his claws retract and his armor feel inadequate. Around him, his crew was experiencing the same thing. Cromax, who had never backed down from any fight, found themselves hesitating, second-guessing their orders, making mistakes they would never normally make. Sir, I'm receiving reports from all ships, the communications officer said, his voice shaking. Crews are reporting equipment failures, coordination problems, and and some kind of psychological interference. The human attack came from directions that shouldn't have been possible. Ships appeared inside the Cromax formation, having somehow passed through solid matter. They struck at critical systems with surgical precision, disabling weapons and engines rather than destroying entire vessels. Lieutenant Commander Walsh coordinated the assault using principles that seemed random to alien minds but followed mathematical patterns based on chaos theory and probability mathematics. Every move the humans made appeared unpredictable, but each action was part of a larger strategy that the Cromax couldn't understand or counter. Their movements make no sense, General Zekoth's tactical officer reported. There's no pattern, no logic we can follow. There is a pattern, Tony Walsh said quietly from his station on the horizon. You just don't know how to see it. The battle that was supposed to last minutes stretched into hours. The massive Cromax battle station, armed with enough firepower to destroy planets, found itself unable to hit targets that danced around it like ghosts. One by one, its weapon systems went offline. Its shield generators overloaded. Its communication arrays were disabled. The Cromax fleet fared no better. Ships that had conquered dozens of worlds found themselves outmaneuvered by vessels a fraction of their size. The psychological warfare was taking its toll, breaking down the coordination and discipline that made Cromax military units so effective. Admiral, the enemy flagship is requesting communication, reported the communications officer on the horizon. Kate nodded. Put them through. General Zekoth appeared on the view screen, but he looked very different from the confident commander, who had started the battle. His armor was cracked, his claws were retracted, and his eyes showed something that Cromax rarely displayed. Uncertainty. What weapons are you using? He demanded. What technology gives you this power? Kate smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. We're using the one thing you never bothered to understand about us, General. We're using our humanity. That makes no sense, Zekoth replied. It doesn't have to make sense to you, Kate said. It just has to work, and as you can see, it works very well. The battle ended when the Cromax battle station finally surrendered. Its weapons were disabled, its shields were down, and its crew was demoralized beyond recovery. The fleet that had been blockading the hyperspace junction was scattered and running for home. Not a single human ship had been destroyed. Several had taken damage, but the casualties were minimal compared to what everyone had expected. As news of the victory spread through galactic communication networks, species that had dismissed humanity as primitive began to reconsider their assumptions. The creatures they had ignored were clearly capable of things that nobody had imagined possible. Admiral Sullivan's final message to General Zekoth was broadcast across the galaxy. The blockade is over, the hyperspace routes are open, and if anyone else thinks they can bully their way to power, they're welcome to try their luck against humanity. The balance of power in the galaxy had just shifted, and everyone knew it. The news of humanity's victory over the Cromax Empire spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Within hours of the battle's end, communication networks were buzzing with reports, analysis, and wild theories about how such a thing could have happened. The species that had dismissed humans as primitive newcomers were suddenly very interested in what Earth had to offer. Ambassador Lisa Carter found herself busier than she had ever been in her diplomatic career. Her small office in the human embassy was constantly filled with representatives from species that had barely acknowledged her existence just days before. The same beings who had ignored her concerns about mining rights were now eager to schedule private meetings. Ambassador Carter, the Altarian Federation would be honored to discuss mutual cooperation agreements, said Chancellor Vilanya during their first formal meeting. The tall, graceful alien had previously spoken to Lisa only in passing, and never about anything important. Vilanya's species looked like elegant birds, with feathers that shifted color based on their emotions. Right now her plumage showed deep blues and purples, which Lisa had learned indicated respect and careful attention. What kind of cooperation did you have in mind? Lisa asked, keeping her voice neutral. We have been having difficulties with the Centauri Collective regarding territorial boundaries in the Sigma sector, Vilanya explained. Traditional negotiations have reached an impasse. Perhaps human mediators could offer fresh perspectives on this ancient dispute. Lisa studied the data that Velanya provided. The conflict had been going on for over 300 years, with both sides claiming the same star systems based on different interpretations of old treaties. Countless diplomatic sessions had failed to resolve the issue, and tensions were rising toward possible military action. Dr. Rodriguez, could you take a look at this? Lisa called to her science advisor. Dr. Alan Rodriguez examined the territorial dispute with the same analytical mind that had helped solve the galaxy's energy distribution problems. Instead of focusing on the legal arguments that both sides had been making, he looked at the underlying reasons for the conflict. The real issue isn't about territory, he told Lisa after studying the data for several hours. It's about trade routes and resource access. Both species need what the other has, but they're so focused on ownership that they're ignoring obvious partnership opportunities. The solution that Dr. Rodriguez proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of dividing the disputed systems between the Altarians and Centaurians, why not create joint ventures that benefited both species? Shared mining operations, cooperative trade networks, and combined research facilities could give everyone what they actually needed. When Lisa presented this proposal to both sides, their initial reaction was skepticism. The idea of working together, instead of competing, was foreign to species that had been enemies for centuries. But as they examined the details, the benefits became impossible to ignore. This could increase our resource output by 40%, Velanya admitted during one of the follow-up meetings. The Centauri representative, a silver-suited humanoid named Director Cole Zen, nodded slowly. And our trade efficiency would improve significantly. But can we trust each other enough to make this work? That's where human oversight comes in, Lisa suggested. We can help establish the frameworks and monitoring systems that ensure fair treatment for everyone involved. 3 weeks later, the Altarian-Centauri Cooperation Agreement was signed in a ceremony that drew attention from across the galaxy. Species that had been preparing for war were now planning joint projects that would benefit billions of beings. Captain Jake Morrison, now promoted to colonel, led a different kind of mission to the outer spiral territories where the original mining dispute had started. Instead of warships, he brought teams of human engineers, sociologists, and development specialists. The primitive civilizations that the Galactic Council had been willing to displace were still there, still building their cities and creating their art. But now they had advocates who understood that intelligence came in many forms and that every species deserved a chance to grow. The key is sustainable development, explained Dr. Sarah Collins, Pete's daughter and a specialist in cross-species cooperation. Instead of strip mining these worlds and moving on, we can help everyone build something that lasts. The humans worked with local populations to establish mining operations that provided resources for galactic markets while preserving the environment and culture of the native species. More importantly, they trained local beings to manage these operations themselves, ensuring that the benefits stayed on their homeworlds instead of flowing to distant corporate empires. The success of these programs attracted attention from other species who had their own territorial disputes and resource conflicts. Soon, human mediation teams were working in dozens of star systems, applying the same principles that had resolved the Altarian-Centauri conflict. Meanwhile, the established powers were discovering that their traditional methods of control were becoming less effective. The hegemony leadership, led by Councillor Vextar, attempted to organize a coalition to contain human influence before it spread too far. These humans are disrupting the natural order, Vextar declared during a closed session of major species leaders. They offer false hope to inferior civilizations and encourage them to believe they deserve equal treatment. But when Vextar tried to rally support for action against humanity, he found fewer allies than expected. Species that had benefited from human mediation were reluctant to oppose Earth. Others were too busy with their own cooperative projects to worry about maintaining old hierarchies. The hegemony's attempt to organize an economic boycott against human-mediated agreements failed when several member species quietly continued their partnerships. The threat of military action fell apart when intelligence reports revealed the extent of human technological capabilities. Chief Engineer Pete Collins, now working as Earth's Director of Technology Sharing, led programs that revolutionized how the galaxy approached scientific development. Instead of keeping innovation secret to maintain competitive advantages, humans encouraged open cooperation that accelerated progress for everyone. When you share knowledge, you don't lose it, Pete explained during a presentation to the Galactic Science Council. You multiply it. Every species that contributes to our research makes the whole galaxy smarter and stronger. The results were dramatic. Diseases that had plagued entire civilizations for millennia were cured through collaborative research programs. Energy systems became more efficient when different species contributed their unique insights. Communication technology improved exponentially when various forms of intelligence worked together on the same problems. Lieutenant Amy Foster, now Captain Foster, coordinated intelligence operations that revealed the true extent of corruption and inefficiency in traditional galactic governance. Her teams used human analytical methods to trace networks of influence and identify patterns of exploitation that had persisted for thousands of years. The evidence she compiled painted a disturbing picture of how the established powers had maintained their positions. Artificial scarcity, manipulated trade routes, and suppressed technologies had kept smaller species dependent and powerless. The galactic economy had been designed to benefit a few at the expense of many. When Captain Foster's reports were published through human communication networks, the reaction was immediate and intense. Species that had accepted their inferior status for generations suddenly understood that their circumstances weren't natural or inevitable. They had been deliberately maintained by those in power. Protests erupted on dozens of worlds. Trade agreements that had seemed reasonable for centuries were revealed as exploitative contracts. Political movements demanding reform gained strength across the galaxy. The hegemony and their allies found themselves facing something they had never dealt with before: organized resistance from species they had always controlled. Worse, these resistance movements were being coordinated and supported by humans who understood how to build effective networks of cooperation. The situation is becoming unstable, Vextar admitted during an emergency meeting of hegemony leadership. The humans have changed the fundamental dynamics of galactic politics. His military advisor, General Sekron, suggested a more direct approach. Perhaps it is time to eliminate the source of this disruption. Without human interference, we can restore proper order. But when the hegemony began mobilizing their forces for action against human space, they discovered that humanity was no longer isolated. The species that had benefited from human partnership were prepared to defend their new allies. Trade networks that had been rebuilt along cooperative lines could easily be converted to support military logistics. Most importantly, the galaxy had learned that humans possessed capabilities that made direct confrontation extremely dangerous. The Cromax Empire had been one of the most powerful military forces in known space, and humanity had defeated them with apparent ease. As the year ended, it became clear that the old galactic order was crumbling. Species that had been enemies were now partners. Civilizations that had been oppressed were demanding their rights. And at the center of all these changes were the humans who had been dismissed as insignes. 2 years after the battle at Vega System, the Galactic Council meeting hall looked completely different. The crystal walls of Nexus Prime still sparkled with starlight, but the inside had been rebuilt to accommodate representatives from over 1,200 species. Where once only the powerful few had comfortable seats near the front, now every delegation had equal space and equal voice. Ambassador Lisa Carter stood at the central podium, no longer the ignored representative of an overlooked species. As the current chair of the council, she called the historic session to order. The transformation had been remarkable, but it had not come without cost. Representatives of all free species, Lisa began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. We gathered today to mark the end of the Hegemony War and the beginning of a new age for galactic civilization. The war had lasted only 3 months, but it had changed everything. When the traditional powers finally decided to crush human influence, through military force they had assembled the largest coalition in galactic history. Over 50 species had contributed ships to the massive fleet that attacked human space. confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm any defense. They had not understood what they were really fighting against. Admiral Kate Sullivan stepped forward to present the final military report. Her hair was now completely white, aged by the stress of commanding humanity's defense during the darkest days of the conflict. But her eyes still held the same steel that had defeated the Cromax. The enemy coalition brought over 10,000 ships to our borders, Kate reported. They expected to face only human vessels. Instead, they found themselves fighting a defensive network that included forces from 437 species. The alliance that humanity had built through cooperation and mutual aid had proven stronger than any military force in galactic history. When the coalition attacked human colonies, they were met not just by Earth's ships, but by vessels from every species that had benefited from human partnership. The Altarian Federation had contributed their fastest scouts. The reformed mining worlds provided heavy cargo ships converted for battle. Even the primitive civilizations from the outer spiral sent what ships they could, determined to defend the species that had given them hope for the future. But the real surprise had been the defections. As the war began, dozens of species that were supposed to be fighting for the coalition switched sides instead. Crews that had been ordered to attack human positions found themselves unable to fire on the people who had helped solve their problems and improve their lives. The enemy fleet was surrounded within 2 weeks, Admiral Sullivan continued. Not by superior firepower, but by their own allies who refused to continue fighting for a cause they no longer believed in. General Zekoth of the Cromax, now a prisoner awaiting trial for war crimes, had surrendered when half his own fleet mutinied. The mighty hegemony forces found themselves abandoned by species that had decided they preferred cooperation to domination. The game fighting had ended not with a great battle, but with the gradual collapse of the coalition as more and more species realized they were fighting against their own interests. Dr. Rachel Kim, now serving as the galaxy's chief science coordinator, addressed the assembly about the technological revolution that had accompanied the political changes. Her small frame seemed almost lost behind the massive podium, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had helped reshape civilization itself. The scientific renaissance we are experiencing has exceeded all projections, Rachel reported. When species work together instead of competing, progress accelerates exponentially. The numbers were impressive. Disease eradication programs had eliminated 17 major plagues that had troubled the galaxy for millennia. Energy efficiency improvements had reduced resource conflicts by 60%. Communication technology now allowed instant contact across galactic distances, making cooperation easier than ever before. Most importantly, the research networks that humans had established were self-sustaining. Species contributed their unique perspectives and capabilities, creating solutions that no single civilization could have achieved alone. The session's most important moment came when the new Galactic Charter was presented for final ratification. This document, drafted by human legal scholars working with representatives from every member species, would replace the old system of hierarchical control with true democratic governance. Captain Jake Morrison, now Fleet Admiral Morrison, watched from the human delegation as the vote proceeded. The transformation still amazed him. 3 years ago, he had stood in this same chamber watching humans be dismissed and ignored. Now, species after species was endorsing a charter based on human principles of equality and cooperation. The voting took hours as each delegation had their say. Some of the older, more traditional species expressed concerns about moving too quickly or changing too much at once, but even they acknowledged that the old system had failed and that something new was needed. The Centauri Collective voted yes, citing the success of their joint ventures with the Altarians. The reformed mining worlds voted yes, grateful for the sustainable development programs that had improved their lives. The outer spiral civilizations voted yes, finally having a voice in galactic affairs. Even former hegemony member species voted to approve the charter, having seen how cooperation served their interests better than domination ever had. When the final tally was announced, the result was overwhelming: 1,247 species in favor, 23 abstentions, and no opposition. The chamber erupted in celebration that transcended species barriers. As the noise died down, Lisa returned to the podium for her closing remarks. She looked out over the vast assembly, thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 3 years ago, humanity was told we didn't understand galactic politics, she began. We were dismissed as primitive creatures who lacked the experience to contribute meaningfully to civilization. In a way, those critics were right. We didn't understand the old way of doing things. She paused, letting her words sink in. We didn't understand why some species deserved more rights than others. We didn't understand why cooperation was seen as weakness, while domination was praised as strength. We didn't understand why the galaxy accepted suffering and conflict as inevitable when solutions were possible. The chamber was completely silent now, every representative hanging on her words. Today, we establish a new understanding. An understanding that every species has value. That diversity makes us stronger, not weaker. That working together serves everyone's interests better than fighting each other. The formal establishment of the new Galactic Alliance was completed with ceremonies that would be remembered for generations. The old council structure, with its rigid hierarchies and concentrated power, was replaced by a system where every voice mattered, and every species had equal representation. As the session ended and representatives began to disperse, carrying news of the transformation back to their home worlds, one truth had become undeniable. The galaxy would never again make the mistake of dismissing any species as unimportant or inferior. Admiral Morrison stood with his old friends, watching as the chamber slowly emptied. Pete Collins, now gray-haired but still grinning, slapped him on the back. Not bad for a bunch of primitive humans, Pete said with a laugh. Lisa Carter joined them, looking tired but satisfied. The real work starts now, she reminded them. Building this new civilization is going to be harder than destroying the old one. But we won't be doing it alone, Admiral Sullivan added as she approached the group. That's the whole point. As they left the chamber together, Jake reflected on how much had changed. The species they had encountered 3 years ago, dismissive and arrogant, had learned that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to lift them up. Humanity had taught the galaxy a lesson that would reshape civilization for millennia to come. They had shown that cooperation was more powerful than competition, that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness, and that the greatest achievements came when different minds worked together toward common goals. The overlooked species had become the architects of a better future, proving that sometimes the greatest power comes from being underestimated until the moment you choose to reveal what you're really capable of achieving. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly what humanity had intended from the very beginning.